Maggie Haberman, you say in your book that to fully reckon with Donald Trump, his presidency and political future, people need to know where he comes from. You go on to paint a picture of the New York City from which you both hail. Can you talk a little bit about that culture?
Sure, and thank you for having me so much to talk about the book. The world that Donald Trump came from in the 60s, 70s, 80s, New York City, corruption touched on so many different aspects of life, aspects of the media, aspects of the political culture. It was a machine politics town, and that was really how he got his education on how things worked, and aspects of the real estate industry. Now, he and his father were not always typical, particularly Donald Trump, not always typical of the way the entire real estate industry operated, but certainly an aspect of it. And he really engaged with the seamier sides of it. You know, rules and regulations were things to get around and to evade. Systems should not apply to him. And this was the ethos that he took with him and exported to Washington, D.C. And now it has had a real trickle-down impact to the Republican Party.
Well, one of the themes in your book is the band of players and supporters who come in and out of his inner circle. Many of them are from those early New York days. Is there any defining characteristic of that group?
Trump spends all of his time looking for people who will defend him. That was part of how he ended up with the lawyer Roy Cohn, who introduced him to Roger Stone. He spends a lot of time looking for who will go fight for him. And the defining characteristics of people who have survived are those willing to do that.
What seems astonishing to me is that they keep coming back, despite the fact he treats them all so appallingly. What is it that brings them back all the time? Is it just that he's a vehicle for power, or is there something else that they've seen in him?
It's a combination of factors. In some cases, he's a vehicle for power. That certainly became the case with the Republican Party. And I explore the fact that, he spent the 2016 campaign talking about how craven Republicans were. And then a lot of them in Washington set out to prove that he was exactly what he said they were, that they literally were just sops to various forms of power. There are other people who have found that their career prospects, even prior to working for Donald Trump, were limited, and he was willing to give them opportunities that they wouldn't have had otherwise. That's a big thing with him.
I'm just wondering how many of those people are still around Trump, or would be if he were to run again for the presidency. How important is that court to shaping what he does, and would it still be there to support him?
There are a couple of people who are still there who were constants, but there's a whole new cast of characters who have risen in his estimation and have his ear. And so it would look different in terms of the actual people in some cases, but the behavioral characteristics would all be the same because he always creates the same show over and over again.
Donald Trump's rise to the presidency, of course, was driven on a wave of populism. He still enjoys extraordinary ratings in the opinion polls, despite all the revelations that have come since he left office. What explains that to you?
I think that people came, and I explore this, to have a vision of Donald Trump and who Donald Trump was that was forged over many decades, brick by brick, this artifice that he constructed of himself as this massive self-made tycoon. It's not what he was. Now, he certainly had successes, but he was really bolstered by his father in ways that were apparent and then ways that were not apparent and didn't get uncovered until many years later by the New York Times, for instance, in terms of getting hold of Trump's tax returns and understanding, the relationship between Trump and his father's money. Once he was running for office and he had been the star of a reality TV show where he was playing himself, as this leatherback chair billionaire, voters believed they knew him. They felt very bonded to him. And no matter how much information they heard otherwise, it didn't bother them. And in some cases, it enhanced their interest in him. They took it as he's fighting back. He's not being politically correct. And so at a certain point, all of these scandals and feuds and fights all just kind of roll into one large ball.
Do you believe he will run again?
I think he's backed himself into a corner where he has to. I think that he needs the protections that the presidency would afford from investigations. Every U.S. president is essentially immune from prosecution. I think that in the course of running for that office, he would be able to say these investigations were witch hunts, and he is facing serious investigations. So, one is a civil suit in New York, which is a little less serious because it's civil, but he is facing 2 DOJ investigations and a state one in Georgia related to his efforts to stay in power. I also think that he would lose the attention and lose the ability to fundraise, and those are very important to him. So I don't think his heart is in it the way it once was, and maybe that will change. But I think it's likelier than not that he announces.
So given all of that, can we be at all certain about where he might take the United States if he was to return to the presidency?
I think that a second Donald Trump term would be driven very heavily by spite. And what that looks like, I think, is a very open question. But we saw a president who was willing to use the Justice Department not just to defend himself, but also to try to attack his enemies. I think what we saw before is very much a prelude for what we would see next time. We know we are dealing with a former president, who doesn't believe in alliances, doesn't believe in the post-World War II order. I think everything we saw, you can expect to see more of if he gets into office again.
Maggie Haberman, thanks so much for your insights and reporting into Donald Trump, and congratulations on the new book.
Thanks so much for having me.